It's 14 hours.
Oh. Turn that off.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. We'll just give it a few minutes as we get more participants into the webinar. Thank you. Great. We're at about 20 participants. Let's give it a minute. Okay, it's 2:02. I'd like to welcome everyone. This is Gatwiri Muthara, Membership and Communications Manager for Compto National. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar, Media Representation and the Implications for Black America. Before we begin, I'd like to give a few webinar housekeeping rules. Everyone should be muted, but in the event that you are not muted, please remember to mute your computer audio or phone. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please send a chat message to the host. Use the Q&A feature to submit questions to the panelists. We'll also allow you to ask questions at the end of the presentation. Please note this Zoom, is being recorded and will be made available on the Compto site. And I'd like to thank you for joining us. And with that, I will turn it over to our President and CEO, Mr. Brad Mims. Brad?
Good afternoon, Compto. And I truly appreciate everyone joining us this afternoon. This is the next in a series of conversations, webinars that we will have about race. And we talk about race and we are concentrating on race post George Floyd, but we want to make sure that as we go forward, that the issue of race stays in the forefront of discussions that we're having about what's going on in our industry and what's going on in our society as a whole. With that, I thank all of the participants today and those who have urged us to move forward and deal with another aspect of race here. And it has to do with media representation and implications for Black America. And again, this is a very important topic. The way that we are portrayed as a people is truly important as we go forward to make sure that we are and become that complete entity as African Americans throughout the United States and the world, as we are portrayed throughout the world. So with that, I'd like to welcome our guests, but I want to turn it over to Adley real quickly. And but before I do that, I have a few words. And for all of you who have been following the passing of one of my heroes, one of my old bosses, John Lewis, I just want to say thank you for paying attention. Thank you for doing the things that he has admonished us to do as he passed and moved forward to be with the Lord. So, but I want to share a couple of experiences that I had this past week. And again, being former staff, and I am always going to stick my chest out and say that I was John Lewis's first legislative director in 1987. And that service that I provided to him was just totally awesome experience as a 32-year-old and as someone who had admired him and followed the civil rights movement from its infancy. So the other thing that I just want to add is, as a result of the experience in the having the Lewis or being part of the Lewis family, I got to sit vigil along with Tara McDaniel, our chief of staff. We got to sit vigil with Congressman Lewis's body and his casket on Tuesday morning for an hour. And spiritually for me, I prayed, I talked to Mr. Lewis, I talked to him and I thanked him, and I reflected on all of the things that he did in his lifetime, the things that he's done for America in his lifetime, and just the impact that he's had on me as I became a part of the beloved community from that point on. So thank you to the Lewis organization. We got to see as he left the Capitol, they had the staff in another position in front of his home, and we got to wave him off and say goodbye to him from Washington, D.C. Again, another wonderful experience. And again, as we go forward, let's make sure that Compto and all of you get in good trouble. So with that, let me toss it over to Adley, and thank you guys for having me this afternoon.
Well, thank you, Brad, and it's great to toss it over to me when you talk about good trouble. I like to get in trouble, and hopefully I will transition into good trouble. But nonetheless, thank you for the opportunity, and I'm fortunate to serve today as the moderator for this event. I know you received the invitation from Compto staff, and I know you've seen the summary of what we're going to talk about today. And I am very fortunate to have the opportunity to introduce Akisa Omulepu. Akisa is going to be our key speaker today. She is an Emmy-nominated documentarian, a director, and a producer. And she has a project that came out in the fall of 2019 called A Dream Deferred, The Broken Promise of New York City Public Housing. And that's streaming on PBS. So if you have not had an opportunity to see it as yet, please do so. What I will share, a couple of things from her bio, but what's most important for our conversation today, I think is really gleaning from Akisa as a journalist, how Blacks are presented or represented within media. Akisa went to Lincoln University at HBCU in Pennsylvania. She also got her graduate degree from Columbia University in New York, her hometown. And she's also a Yale World Fellow. And what's not on Akisa's bio, and I didn't tell Akisa I was gonna say this, so she's just gonna have to bear with me, is that Akisa is my first cousin. And a lot of Akisa's work I have become aware of through this process of just delving in and being prepared for this discussion. But when all of these issues happened and they impact us as Compto as well as professionals in the transportation space, I reached out to Akisa and asked her if she would be willing to help have a conversation and share with us from her perspective the work that she's done in ensuring that the images of Black people are portrayed in an appropriate way with the lens on humanity as well as empathy, and just making sure that our stories are being told by people who look like the people that are telling the stories. And because of this, I am very, very happy to be able to introduce you to Akisa, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Adley, thank you for that introduction. Yes, Adley is my first cousin. Adley is a native New Yorker who grew up together in New York City. Her mom and my mom are sisters from Panama. So we're both first generation Americans. It's really wonderful to be here. I'd like to thank Brad for reaching out to me, Freddie, Gatwiri, and the entire COMTO staff for organizing today's event. And before we delve into this topic, I wanted to talk about why this is so important to me. It's so important to me because, as I said, I'm a native New Yorker, but I've always been fascinated by the moving image. And growing up, I was also fascinated but deeply mystified by why people who look like me in the news were either starving or represented in a way that didn't reflect my own personal views as a Black person growing up in New York City. So the moving image was always very, very compelling to me. With that said, through the twists and turns of life, finally got to graduate school. I was a math teacher before, and I finally transitioned to media and documentaries. I lived in Nairobi, Kenya briefly. I was a foreign correspondent, and that's where I really delved into the global Black experience and examining and looking at those images through that lens of a global perspective as a native New Yorker, as a first generation American, as someone who's both Caribbean and African. All of those identities inform how I see the world, and I think it's important to deconstruct that to also take ownership of it. So with that said, I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to be toggling between sharing my screen and not sharing my screen. And I hope participants, Gatwiri is working in the back end to let me know if people have any questions. Please feel free to let me know if you have any questions, or you can type in the chat box your questions or in the Q&A box. So with that said, I'm going to share my screen. Give me 1 second. Oh dear. Okay, here we go. So, media representation and the implications for Black America. We're starting with this image. This is Roxy Roker, who was a character on a very famous sitcom, The Jeffersons, from the 70s into the 80s. And she's representative, I think, of how Black women and how Black people, an element of how Black people were portrayed. But if we delve a little bit further, I want to look at the image in totality and past being prologue. So I'm going to read this quote. This scene is from Gone with the Wind, and the character was named Mammy from Gone with the Wind. And I find this quote so fascinating because she says, no use to try and, I can't do the accent, so bear with me. No use to try and sweet talk me, Miss Scarlett. I knows you ever since I put the first pair of diapers on you. I says I was going to Atlanta with you, and going I is. So now, with this framework in mind, we see a character, because it is a character / caricature of how a slice of Black people were portrayed at the turn of the last century. Gone with the Wind came out in 1939, 1940. And we have the dutiful servant, fresh out of slavery. And that is kind of emblematic of how Black people have been, or a slice of how Black people have been portrayed. But let's delve a little bit further. This next image is, as we all know, LeBron James and King James and Gisele Bündchen. If anyone wants to chime in, Gatwiri, just let me know. I'm in full screen, so I can't quite hear anybody. And if we just analyze this image just for a second, if anyone wants to jump in and tell me what they see, I see LeBron James. He potentially looks aggrieved, or he looks intense with his basketball in hand. He's holding on to Gisele Bündchen, maybe to save her, maybe, I'm not too sure. But the reason why I want to start with this image is because it's seemingly benign. It's the cover of Vogue magazine, the hallowed fashion, institution. But if we delve deeper, and we look at, oftentimes images use resource or source material to create this image. And this image is no different. From at surface, it just seems like, oh my gosh, King James, LeBron James is on the cover of Vogue with a very famous international model. But if you look at the image that inspired it, it really goes into the kind of insidious and pervasive stereotypes that we are constantly combating, battling, trying to avoid. So this is the source image for this Vogue magazine cover. And this Vogue magazine cover came out in 2008, if I remember correctly. And it sticks in my brain for so many reasons. First is the obvious. The source image is of this animalistic type character who is here to take a precious white woman away, and how the army must stop. Because if you just look at the word, it says destroy this mad brute, enlist in the US Army. That's what it says. So this allegedly was the source image for this Vogue magazine cover. So at surface, you think, oh, LeBron James, he looks intense. But if we really deconstruct and look deeply, it's a subtle yet insidious coded language as to how Black people, Black men, Black women are consistently portrayed in media. Mind you, this Vogue cover is from the 2000s. Like, this is not ancient history. This is in our lifetime. And how the past still informs today. So that's what I mean when I say the past is our prologue. The past continues to inform how Black people are caricatured, portrayed, and really pigeonholed through society. So let's just sit with this for a moment. I'd love to hear anyone's feedback. Gatwiri, I know you're working back, and if anyone has an audio comment they'd like to make, I welcome that at this point. But I'd like to also just stay with this image for just a little bit longer, because to say that this image of LeBron James and Gisele Bündchen was an accident, it doesn't hold water. It doesn't hold water. I think the photographer knew clearly, had a very clear image they were trying to communicate, a very clear message, however subtle they thought they were making it, and continuing this negative portrayal of Black people as a whole. And so now, how that actually manifests in today's world. So we have this quote unquote mad brute who must be stopped. 60 years later, we have LeBron James, who technically must be put in his place and must be stopped. That is how insidious it is. So now let's go on to how it portrays in today's world. I took this screen grab from WSB, which is apparently one of the most popular news channels in Atlanta. And the imagery can't be any less startling. We have 6 images, and in those 6 images, 3 out of those 6 images have Black men in some kind of criminalized capacity. Now, I'm not saying that crime doesn't happen, but I question if it happens at this rate. So we have 6 images and two objects. Of those 6 images, 5 out of those 6 images are criminal Black men. And that is how the persistent and intentional imagery of Black people continues. Yes?
We did have a question from the Q&A portion. And someone wanted to go back to the LeBron picture and wants to know, what is the role of LeBron James in this picture?
What do you mean, what is the role of him?
That's the question. I don't know if the person wants to elaborate.
Please, if they can get on audio, I'd love to hear that question. Well, I can tell you my interpretation. at face value, you see this image and you think, fantastic, LeBron James has made the cover of Vogue, a fashion magazine. But if you really deconstruct this image, he's not adding a fashion value because it is a fashion magazine. He's not adding a fashion value to this image. He's actually taking up most of the frame just in terms of his presence and his stance. I'm sure that stance was deliberate by the photographer. And with his mouth agape and his teeth kind of exposed that way, it doesn't, evoke the serene, happy-go-lucky, frolicking image that the model is portraying. He actually looks somewhat menacing. He doesn't look like they could be a couple. He doesn't look like they're in love. He doesn't look like they're friends. He looks as if he is a menacing presence in this tableau. So that's what I think, that's my interpretation of it. Gatwitty, does someone want to come and say anything further?
Yes, we have Larry Delgado. Larry, I'm going to unmute you and you can ask your question or make your comment.
Hi, Larry.
Hello, how are you? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for this, and thank you for Kamto for putting this together. One question that I have is in so many aspects, and we've seen in the news where the Laura Ingrams of the world will say to black men that they should shut up and dribble, whereas white men such as Drew Brees are able to have their own political views. But I question as to why they didn't show him in front of the school, and I think it goes in line with what you were talking about. Instead of displaying the wonderful community services that our African-American partners and allies are doing, this is what they choose to put on the cover. And
right. To give a full picture, this Vogue cover was 2008, and this was before he opened up his school. However, he was still doing good works in 2008. So I hear what you're saying, Larry. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that comment. I'm going to move on now to this very recent cover of the incredible Viola Davis. And again, a seemingly beautiful, benign pose with her exposed, strong back. But often in media, there's a source image that informs how magazine covers are taken. And this particular image sparked a lot of controversy online because the source image, now mind you, we have to be mindful of how, even as Black people or people of color, how we think of ourselves. So the source image for this cover was the very, very well-known image of the enslaved man who had whip marks on his back. So now the reason why this image is terribly controversial is that Viola Davis is an Oscar-winning actress. Tonys, Oscars, movies galore, but we are still viewed as enslaved people. We are still, why didn't they do a frontal image of her? Why didn't they, take a profile of her with her stunning look? But instead, the source image is of an enslaved man. So then we have to go back to how insidious and pervasive the imagery really is, and how Black women and Black men are continually being, in very subtle and real ways being put in their place through seemingly beautiful imagery. But something in you sparks, gosh, that feels familiar in a way that I can't quite put my finger on. And this is what we're constantly being reminded of, who we are and how we need to keep in our place. So with that said, I'm going to show you another image of another short video. This video is only about 2 minutes long, and it's a continuation of what I call persistent and pervasive imagery of specifically Black women. So I'm going to share my screen again. Give me 1 second, please. Thank you so much.
Oh, now, Miss Scarlett, you come on and be good and eat just a little. No! I'm going to have a good time today. Do my eating at the barbecue. If you don't care what folks says about this family, I does. I has told you and told you that you all this time Richard John Wilkinson and eat like a field hand and gobble like a hog. Fiddle-dee-dee.
I just wish I could have gotten one punch in.
Samantha, I have told you that's not very ladylike.
But you told me to stick up for my rights.
Yeah, but that's when they're smaller than you.
Now, I'm sure there's at least one thing that you can think of good to say about Aunt Esther. Now, think about it and say it.
Watch it. Careful. Look out. That's what I'm trying to say is that you're overly generous. Every time you open up your mouth, you give away your ignorance. Where I'ma live? I knew it. This is all your fault, Pam. They don't want me having pets up in my place. Get the leash. You got to go, partner.
Joanna!
C'est ce matin-là que tout commença. C'était à Dakar. J'ai du travail chez les Blancs.
Just between you and I, Stella, I'm not doing so bad. I got a diamond ring, a diamond bracelet, a swell scarf. Not to mention the flowers. Not bad, huh? I got a sugar daddy, a sailor, marine, and a preacher man if I want to take the time to work on him. How am I doing, kid?
So that was just a short 2-minute montage specifically about how Black women are portrayed in media. Often they're the dutiful house person, and how that image is so pervasive from past to present, from Mammy and Gone with the Wind to Give Me a Break in the 1980s, how it's persistent and how Black women are degraded in their appearance, from Sanford and Son in the 1970s to Martin in the 1990s. Martin actually compared, and let me be clear, I thought Martin was hilarious. I still think it's hilarious. I still watch Sanford and Son. I still think it's hilarious. But at the same time, we can't turn a blind eye to the real, consistent, persistent, and pervasive negative imagery that is subtly being drilled into our minds as well as to the world's minds about how Black people, how they are, how they think, Black women, how they are in the world. They're either over-sexualized or they are viewed as some kind of animal. She was literally compared to a dog. And so at surface, it's funny, but over the arc of history, it's actually incredibly damaging in real significant and sustainable and economic our futures as a collective. So I think that's really, really important to say. Gatwidi, if you can let me know if anyone has a question, I'd be.
Yes, Cynthia Berman has her hand raised. Cynthia, I will unmute you so you can ask your question.
Hi, Cynthia. You're muted, Cynthia.
Okay.
One more chance.
We'll try
Cynthia?
one more time. Cynthia, you should be able to speak. Can you unmute yourself? Okay, let's move on.
Is there somebody else?
We have not questions, but comments from the Q&A. One, going back to the LeBron image, he has a responsibility to deconstruct this and make his own decision. He is not an innocent victim in this. And someone else says, it is important that the discussion includes how Black people also contribute, some knowingly and some unknowingly, to how we are portrayed. That's it for now.
Don't think LeBron James was aware of how he was being framed. I don't know LeBron personally, but I honestly, from what my takeaway is that he is very, very proactive. He is shaped and the photographer may have used this source of color. We are complicit in our own degradation. Image of Viola Davis was an African-American man. And so he said he was inspired by that image of the enslaved man, that very iconic image, and I forget his name, which is not good on my part, of that iconic image of the enslaved man with the whip marks on his back. That was his inspiration. So we have to acknowledge how we have to not only be aware of our own complicity, but how we have to actively and persistently, like an insidious cancer, be active in decolonizing our own, how that manifests in our lives. So I'm going to thank you for everyone who has questions. Gatwiri is going to be monitoring the questions on the back end. And if you want to ask questions, please just put in the Q&A box, and Gatwiri will let me know what those questions are. So I'm going to share my screen again. Okay. So now that brings us back to the real life harm that some of those images that we kind of witnessed, how they play, and the real implications in the lives of Black and Brown people across this country. And I point to this fantastic article from the 1619 Project, which I'm sure you all have read. If not, you can find it on the New York Times website, nytimes.com. It was created by the Pulitzer Prize winning brilliant mind of Nicole Hannah-Jones. And the 1619 Project delved into the different aspects of the Black experience in this country. This particular article piqued my interest because I thought it not only encapsulates the ongoing issues, but since this is an audience of transportation leaders in different parts of this country and engineers in different parts of this country, I thought this would be a really good way to link these images and the real life implications for Black and Brown people. So if you've read this article, please feel free to chime in the Q&A in the chat box. I'd be happy to hear your thoughts. But to sum up this article, the title of the article is, "What Does a Traffic Jam in Atlanta Have to Do with Segregation?" And the answer is quite a lot. So the very brief article, you can actually take your time, you can read it, glance at it right now if you'd like to. The article looks at MARTA, the train system in Atlanta, and how I-20 was constructed by Mayor Hartsfield to actually separate or bifurcate Black and white people, and how it was a deliberate and intentional route created to separate Black and white people, and how there was persistent opposition to bringing in public transportation because they felt it would bring in undesirables or quote unquote illegals into the suburbs. And how not only is that continuing segregation, but into the future, it's an environmental problem because more people have to drive. And the continuing of this persistence of not of putting Black and Brown people in remote locations and not integrating public transportation into the folds of community, the real life implications are not only for Black and Brown people, but for the environment and for society at whole. So as we continue, I'm gonna leave that there and I'm gonna pivot to Brownsville, Brooklyn. Brownsville, Brooklyn is a very semi-large part of Brooklyn. It's pretty remote. Not a lot of public transportation gets there. And it's one of the highest concentrations of public housing in the entire United States. I'll say that again, in the entire United States, the highest concentration of public housing in the entire United States. And this image is an aerial view of some of the public housing facilities dotted in Brooklyn, in Brownsville, Brooklyn. It has some of the highest crime rates in New York City. It has very high asthma rates in New York City. And as I mentioned before, the remoteness makes it very complex for people living in this part to get into Manhattan and get into downtown Brooklyn to work. A train ride from Brownsville to, Midtown Manhattan is about an hour one way. So imagine you're a family, you're relying on public transportation. A car is not really a viable option for people who live outside of New York, simply because of the sheer density. Most people do not have cars in New York City. They rely heavily on public transportation. So now the real life implications for some of the imagery and some of the persistent imagery that we saw earlier plays out here. And I'm going to share just a maybe 2 minute, 10-second clip of a documentary short that Adley mentioned that I was commissioned to do for PBS called A Dream Deferred. That title comes from Langston Hughes' poem Harlem, What Happens to a Dream Deferred? A Dream Deferred, the Broken Promise of New York City Public Housing. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and go to that video, if you give me just 30 seconds. And Gatwitty, if you can keep me up to date on questions, I'd greatly appreciate it. Okay? I'm gonna share just 1 second. Okay.
I'm Shalevia Pearson, and I'm 43 years old. I've been living in Ceplo houses for my entire life. They had to bust the ceiling open here. They had to knock this entire wall down. The maintenance man came in here and just fell through the wall. That's how corroded the walls are. It had been like many years of just like holes in my walls, leaks behind the walls, and I became pregnant. And I knew that I was like ingesting a lot of the mold and the mildew while I was pregnant. At the time, I was working at Baruch College, for the Human Resources Department. I'm getting sick. I'm not feeling well. I still have to go to work. Just one night, in the 6 months, my water broke in the middle of the night. On August 1st, 2:13 in the morning, at 2 pounds and 13 ounces, Sakajwa was born. She was just developing outside, and she was born at 7 months, opposed to 9 months. So it was very touch and go. And they said, we had to give her a bunch of shots for her lungs. They're not developed. Her brain isn't fully developed. I was like traumatized from the entire experience. Bang, leg lift.
Oh, I gotta hold on first.
Bang. Good job. It was nothing that I can do about her being preemie, right? And her being born with underdeveloped lungs from the beginning, right? So she was always ultra sensitive. So to bring her into an environment that's just not 100% air quality like the hospital, it was very touch and go for me. I didn't get any sleep when she was a baby. Everything else that occurred after she left the hospital at 4 pounds and 6 ounces is when they released her. The asthma kicked in when she returned home.
Okay, so that was just some of the real life implication. And now I'd like to turn it over for some Q&A so we can unpack some of what we saw and also share some of your experiences as transportation engineering executives and how these portrayals impact your role. So I'd like to bring Adley back in. Adley, there you go. Hi, Adley.
Hello, can you see me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, cool. So thank you, Akisa. I really appreciate the opportunity to hear and see what you put together. And also one thing that I just had to jot down, even though I watched the full documentary, I just saw the Student of the Month certificate, and it was from PS 156, and I went to PS 156, so that's kind of crazy. Yeah.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Anyway,
when were you in Brownsville?
We have to talk about that, but nonetheless, thank you for sharing. And I had a couple of questions. You did share a bit about the imagery and understanding the past and how it informs the future. And especially when you moved on to talk about, public transportation, inclusive of, the road network and how it really segregated communities. And most of us on the call are well aware of this because this is a space that we occupy. But when you kind of look at all the elements that you presented today, and you think about the implications and how the stories have been told, I guess my question for you would be, as professionals in the public transportation space, how can we take control or have more of a deliberate, I guess, control of the narrative as it is projected in the media related to public transportation? And I would say maybe specifically transit. And I'll give one quick example and then open it up to you, as well as anyone who's on the call. If you've had similar experiences, please share. But I know when I was in New Orleans, there were incidents where they may have been, a shooting, and the shooting occurred on a street that had a bus stop. However, the headline in the paper says shooting at Norda stop, where the shooting was not at the bus stop. The people shooting were not standing in the bus shelter. They were just on a block with a bus stop, right? So then our marketing department is working with the paper to get them to retract it or at least correct, the location, because now it gives this perception that our bus stops are unsafe and people are getting shot there. Of course, they'll do something in most cases, but it doesn't show up as, the front page of the paper when they do the retraction, right? So yes, we work behind the scenes to get them to correct it, but still, the damage has already been done. So I'm just giving that as one example of, some of the issues that we deal with in the public transit space. And if you have any suggestions of how we can take a little more control of how the narrative is presented. And if not, what is it that we can do?
Well, there are a couple of things. Thank you for that question, Adelie. There are a couple of things. I'll start from the advertising side. I know that a lot of transit, well, at least in New York, I can't speak for other cities, advertising dollars fund a lot of transportation, a significant part of the transportation budget. So I think a great starting point is demand that the people who are advertising, that the imagery that they post in your public transit is, number one, representative of your city. Number two, is not degrading, and have some sort of a rubric of understanding of how those images, I'm going to get to the actual news though, of how Black and brown people are being portrayed in ads across your transit, bus, rail, different lines. That's an immediate way, that's an immediate impact. You'll be surprised if you demand of your advertisers, these are the rubrics that I will accept in terms of for you to advertise your products or services. That's really important. Another immediate way, I think it would be great if people often underestimate the power of an op-ed. Op-eds are really, really powerful and direct tools to get out into the ethos, the atmosphere of the printed world that, hey, I have an opinion and this is how I'm going to voice it. So there are multi-pronged ways for people who are in some kind of leadership position when it comes to advertising in public transit, demanding a rubric of how Black and brown people are represented in the imagery in transit in the various form, bus, rail, blah, blah, blah. I recommend that maybe as a collective, COMTO, or people in different forms of senior leadership across the country within COMTO, make a deliberate effort to write op-eds when you see something that is not in alignment with your core beliefs. But then also it's important to just push back. Call the station. Call the station. You'd be surprised. The general manager of each station really does listen to the feedback of their viewers. Local news is more profitable than national news. I'll say that again. Local news is more profitable than national news. And the reason why it's more profitable, I think of my mother. She watches the news for the weather and the headlines. So she will sit and watch, and of course they put weather at the end. So you have to sit through, they say in news, if it bleeds, it leads. You have to sit through all of this imagery at the top of doom, gloom, fire, and stabbings. But if you call your local station and say, hey, and persistently call and maybe have a collective action of like, I don't want to see this. I want it framed in a different way. That is also very, very impactful.
Oh, thank you. That's really good. And I know as it relates to the advertising dollars, which unfortunately is not as significant a part of the budget, but it is a part of the budget. And I do know that some transit agencies have even worked to prohibit advertisements for like alcohol and other, other, I would say, what do they call them? Secular type advertisements, just because of the imagery that it gives, especially within the Black community. So I know there are some movements in that direction, but that was very good to present. And also the op-eds, I think that is really good. And as Compto, again, this is a call that's focused on helping the Compto membership understand how we could advance the conversation and make improvements. And if we could collectively work together in a strategic way, right? Since our chapters represent several different cities, over 40 different cities, we could collectively release op-eds to really, at least make it clear what it is that's important to us and what our values are as it relates to public transportation.
With that in mind, Adley, I'm going to interject. I'm a member, like Compto is for your sector. I'm a member of NABJ, which is the National Association of Black Journalists, a national organization, thousands of members. And so when they I'm not on the board, so I'm not speaking for NABJ, let me be super clear. However, they often put out statements when they see something that is not in alignment with the core beliefs of how Black people should be portrayed in media. It is not unheard of where you will find the president of NABJ meeting with the president of NBC or the president of ABC or CBS demanding something be done. And how impactful that is, because oftentimes it's through our organizations, whatever your sector is, collectively deciding, hey, we're putting our thumb on this. This doesn't make sense, and we're going to use our collective voice to enact good trouble, as John Lewis would have us do, and that good trouble to shift the paradigm around whatever topic you're trying to change.
Okay, well, thank you. No, that definitely is something that I have put a star next to for us to further that conversation. And then also calling the local news. That is a good point. I did not realize that local news generated more revenue than national news. So again, we need to build strong relationships with our local news outlets. So thank you for that.
And not only continuing along with the local news angle, it would be really a part of a way to build bridges with local media is often having a media roundtable. So this is another immediate effective tool that the Compto membership and leadership can do in different regions. I'm not too sure of the structure, but oftentimes I also do consult with media. I highly recommend getting to know your local beat reporter for, like in New York, since New York is a big city, we actually have a transit reporter in New York 1, and most of the stations have transit reporters because we're 8.6 million people in New York City. So getting to know the beat reporter for your city, state, region will often preempt, reporting that is not reflective or fully accurate or fully what you're trying to communicate about your sector. So I recommend possibly, and a roundtable, it sounds fancy. You just invite, from print to radio to broadcast, you invite maybe 6 to 10 people. It's usually breakfast. You buy coffee, you buy some croissants or bagels, whatever. And you get to know each other, and you have this maybe twice a year, maybe 3 times a year. And that is a direct way to stay engaged with the media. So let's say, going back to your New Orleans story, that story was not fully vetted, I think that's safe to say. Through a collective group, you could have called up and say, hey, Jane Doe or John Doe, I had a problem with that. And so the retraction could have even been on air if a relationship had been established.
Okay.
Gatwitty, do we have any questions from audience or audience members who want to jump in?
I just wanted to let you know that we have about 10 minutes left. Did you want to end it with audience questions? Is that okay? Or did you have more of a presentation?
No, that'll be great.
Okay, all right. I'll go to the first question. Can you speak to the characterization of how Black men and women are portrayed in the past 5 to 10 years as compared to the past?
There's definitely been a shift, for sure. And we have to acknowledge that the demographics of America are also shifting as well. In about 20 to 30 years, the United States would be majority people of color, and that is significant. So it's, I need to use my words carefully. It's shifting and mutating, is what I'll say. Simply because the negative portrayals are still with us and kind of very insidious and subtle. So that's why I say it's mutating. But at the same time, the local news usually doesn't lead with a Black man was, they'll just say a man. So that is a significant shift from a local news perspective. So there is a significant shift from, let's say, 50 years ago, but that doesn't mean there's still more work that needs to be done.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is, can you please talk about how in just about every instance, a Black woman on television and in movies almost always has to have sex or bare her body? It burns me up inside and I'm so tired of it.
Well, this speaks to, I'm working on a documentary. I'm gonna go around and come back to answer your question. Okay. I'm working on a documentary right now, and it's called Muse, Mammy, Mule, and how Black women are portrayed in media, art, and culture. And this speaks to, I think, the over-sexualization of Black womanhood, and that's definitely deliberate and part of a larger dynamic at play. And I think there are two factors. I think it goes to the intention of how it's being framed, because intention speaks louder. If the intent is simply to over-sexualize Black women, that's very obvious and it feels icky and it doesn't feel like it serves the story. But if it's, you know, some kind of narrative that speaks to a larger part of the character, that's something completely different. But yes, it's not uncommon to see the over-sexualization of Black womanhood portrayed in media, and it's quite problematic because that translates into real life in, you know, the exploitation of Black women, missing Black girls and women, you know, when they go missing, it's underreported and not fully investigated. So there are, again, the ties of the implication into real life are very real.
Thank you, Akisa. I have 2 more questions right now from Ashley. Do you think with respect to these degrading images, Black people can regain power by changing their narrative? I immediately thought of the images of the scarred slave when I saw the magazine cover, but my admiration for Viola made me lean further toward an acknowledgement / homage to the images past.
So do I think that with respect to these images, degrading images of Black people regain power by changing the narrative? Do they, you know, reclaim it? I think it depends. You know, it's a case-by-case basis. I do believe there is power in reclaiming narratives, but reclaiming them for what end? You know, I think we need to be deliberate and intentional about how we see ourselves, how we portray ourselves as, and more importantly, that we portray ourselves as complex people that we are. We're not one thing, we're multifaceted. So reclaiming images, again, goes to, my question is, to what end? So yes, you can reclaim what images, but what are you gonna do with that reclamation? Are you gonna, you know, perpetuate these stereotypes that don't serve us moving forward in life?
Okay. Our next question is, I have seen images of paratransit services or other special services offered either by the government or private entities.
You've seen a para what? I'm sorry, repeat that word.
Paratransit.
What's paratransit, please?
It's transportation for persons with disabilities.
Okay, yes, of course. Okay, paratransit. Yeah. Okay.
Usually the person assisting the person with the disability is a person of color, and the person receiving service is a white person. And this may be an accurate representation of the reality in that people of color are involved in that type of service. What are your thoughts about this? Did you need me to?
It's real. It's real. I mean, the reality is, you know, that's why the majority of people impacted by Corona are people of color, because the reality is people of color tend to be in service industry work as an extension of enslavement. You know, it's not a secret, a mystery, or a revelation that the majority of Black and brown people tend to be in the service industry. And so your question is, what was the question specifically again?
I guess she wants to know your views on that type of imagery.
It's one slice, you know, again, it goes, I think if that's the only image, it's problematic, but it goes back to that dutiful Black person here to serve the masses. And I find it problematic. And again, that imagery must be balanced.
Okay, right now we don't have any hands raised or any more questions, and we are 5 minutes out. So Akisa and Adelie, I don't know if you guys wanted to.
I just want to say one last thing. And before I wrap up again, I want to thank Compto for having me on. Media representation is my life's work. I think it's really important that not only do we investigate and deconstruct these images, that we are active participants in dismantling and reframing how we're seen in America and around the world. Around the world, for me, I think that's really important. It's a global dialogue because colonialism happened across the globe. So this is not an isolated incident to the United States. As someone who's Panamanian, my mom is from Panama, my father was from Kenya. And I've lived in Kenya as a foreign correspondent, but I'm a native New Yorker to the core. What Black people and people of color and Latino people go through is not in isolation. And I think it's important that we are deliberate and be in community with Black and brown people around the world, because this is pervasive and it's global. So again, I want to thank Compto. I encourage everyone to be in community and think about how, because we all play a role in our small way, how as Compto members, you can shift the paradigm in seeing imagery that is reflective of your experiences and asking and demanding that change. Because well, not anymore because of Corona, but when Corona wasn't around, you could find me on the train, not so much now. And when Corona's over, I'll be back on the train. So how that information seeps into our psyche on a daily basis if you take public transportation with regularity. And how just by the simple act of demanding better imagery from advertisers, that can impact so many people in subtle and profound ways.
Hey, Akisa, we have 3 minutes, and I was asked to give one more question.
Sure.
Actually, 2 more. Can you please share the link for the full documentary on Brownsville?
Sure can.
You can give that to me and I'll pass that along.
Yes, I can tell you, and then Gatwiri will also share it. You can just go to you can Google search A Dream Deferred PBS and it'll come up. Again, A Dream Deferred PBS, it'll come up, but Gatwiri will also share it with you.
Yes, and so this question, as a parent and grandparent, what are your suggestions for raising children who are more aware of the message they send when posting photos on social media?
Okay, as a parent or grandparent, what are your suggestions for raising children who are more aware of the message they send when, wow, social media. Okay, social media is a lot. And I don't want to impose my views, but I think young people should not be in social media. That's my personal view. It's not reflective of anybody else. I think it's a huge responsibility, and young people have to be fully aware of the implications, because I grew up without social media. I could be young and carefree and not live in anything, silly thing I did not live with me for forever. But in today's digital age, one slip up can be with you to the day you die. So I'm really leery of young people being on social media. But to answer your question, I think it's a tool that has to be taught, and parents, grandparents, aunties, uncles, parental figures need to teach. You just don't, in my opinion, you don't give a phone. You actually have to teach, how do I post? What do I post? What image, what am I communicating when I do post? So I think it's a tool that has to be taught.
Thank you. So with that, Akisa, thank you so much. And thank you, Adelie. Adelie, I don't know if you had any closing remarks as well.
Yes, well, thank you, Compto, as always, for creating this space where we can have these conversations. I have been checking the chat and seeing that lots of people have been chatting along the way, and that we've gotten some positive feedback, and I'm hoping that those who haven't chatted, that you also thought that this was a great webinar or conversation. Again, the intent is to, really help us to think broadly about the imagery and how we're presented or represented in media, and then use this conversation as a way for us to start planting the seeds on how we move forward and, really controlling our narrative and ensuring that we understand the past so that when we work to develop a better future, that we are being very deliberate on what we're doing. And, Akisa, thank you so much for pointing out some of the simplistic ways that we have been portrayed and continue to be portrayed. And unbeknownst to us, it's coming from a very hateful and harmful place, right? And it happens in a way that is easy for us to miss. So thank you for sharing with us. Thank you for volunteering your time to us. I know you're super busy, and I appreciate everything that you have done for Compto and for me. So thank you, Akisa. Thank you, Compto, for allowing this to happen. And thank all of you participants for staying with us and fully engaging.
Hi, everybody. Thanks again. It was great fun.
I'd like to thank you for joining us. Please note a follow-up email with the link to the recording and a post-event survey will be emailed to you shortly. And please know that a schedule of Compto webinars can be found on our events calendar at comptonational.org. With that, have a good afternoon and a good weekend.